Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going deep, a deep dive into how Native American identities were, well, kind of twisted and misrepresented back in the 18th and 19th centuries.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating but often overlooked part of American history. And unfortunately, a lot of the repercussions of that manipulation are still felt today.
Exactly. And to really get into it, we're going to be looking at Erica Coleman's book, That the Blood Stay Pure. She digs deep into Virginia's obsession with racial purity.
And its impact on both Native American and the African American
Right.
communities.
It's not just one group that was affected by this. We're talking about interconnected systems of oppression here.
Absolutely.
So, to kick things off, Coleman opens her book with a story about the Rappahannock Indian Baptist Church. This was back in 2004. A couple, Lori and Jasper Battle, were denied membership because Lori, a Rappahannock Indian, had married an African-American man.
Oh, wow.
It caused a pretty big controversy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this really highlights how marginalized groups, having faced exclusion themselves, sometimes end up replicating those same systems of exclusion within their own communities.
It's almost like a ripple effect. The pain and exclusion just keeps spreading.
Right, exactly.
And it makes you think about how we define belonging and the lasting psychological impact of prejudice.
Absolutely.
So, to understand how this played out on a bigger scale,
Yeah.
I think we need to talk about the one-drop rule. Can you give us a little breakdown of what that was all about?
Yeah, so the one drop rule was basically this idea that any trace of African ancestry, no matter how small, automatically made you black. It was used to solidify the idea of blackness as a kind of racial impurity, at least in the eyes of white society.
And it's just wild how this idea, this concept of the one-drop rule, wasn't just limited to white society.
Unfortunately, no. It seeped into some Native American communities as well. Individuals with even distant African ancestry were excluded, which further divided and fractured relationships between Black and Native American communities.
And this wasn't just about social separation either.
No.
Coleman's book really emphasizes how this had serious economic consequences, especially when it came to owning land.
Yeah, that's a really important point. During the 18th and 19th centuries, so many Native Americans were misidentified as Black or mixed race to take away their land.
It's awful. And to make matters even worse, this was woven into official government records with the Dawes Rolls.
Exactly. The Dawes Rolls were basically this government list that aimed to break up tribal lands and assimilate Native Americans into white society. They did this by forcing them to accept individual land allotments, which benefited white settlers.
So they were supposed to be about dividing land fairly, but were actually used to take even more land from Native Americans.
Yes, and on top of that, the Dawes Rolls were filled with misclassifications. So many Native Americans were falsely listed as Black or mixed race, further taking away their ancestral lands.
It's insane how bureaucratic tools were used to just carry out this injustice. And it didn't stop there, right? There was also the Racial Integrity Act in 1924.
Yeah, that's right. The Racial Integrity Act was passed in Virginia in 1924. This law didn't just ban interracial marriage, it actually tried to erase Native American identity entirely.
So they were trying to legally erase an entire group of people.
Pretty much. Figures like Walter Plecker, who was the state registrar at the time, were fixated on this idea of racial purity. He considered anyone with any African ancestry as Black, regardless of how they identified themselves, their cultural practices, or tribal affiliations.
It's hard to even grasp the audacity of it all. How could someone like Plecker have so much power over people's lives like that?
Well, it speaks to the deep-seated racism and the belief in white supremacy that was very pervasive at that time. Plecker was a big supporter of eugenics. It's this pseudoscientific ideology that believed in selective breeding to, quote-unquote, improve the human race. He genuinely thought he was doing good by purifying Virginia.
That's just disturbing. It really shows how these supposedly scientific ideas can be used to justify such horrible things. But even with all this going on, there were still some glimmers of hope, right?
Absolutely. While people like Plecker were trying to rewrite history, many Native American communities and individuals fought back. They challenged his authority and stood up for their right to self-identification.
That's so inspiring. It's amazing how even in those dark times, people found the strength to resist. But before we get into those acts of resistance, I think it's important to make sure everyone listening really gets the impact of these policies. So can you remind us why something like the Racial Integrity Act was so damaging?
Sure. So the Racial Integrity Act, along with other things going on at that time, really hurt Native American communities in many ways. It denied them their tribal identities, took their land, and fragmented their communities. It also created this atmosphere of fear and silence, making it really hard for people to openly acknowledge and celebrate their heritage.
It's like they were trying to wipe out an entire culture.
Mm.
So were there any legal challenges to these discriminatory laws?
Yes, and one of the most important ones was the Loving v. Virginia case in 1967. This case finally made anti-miscegenation laws illegal, which was a huge blow against the whole foundation of the Racial Integrity Act.
Right. Loving v. Virginia is such a well-known case. But something that many people might not know is that Mildred Loving, one of the people who brought the case to court, was both African American and Native American.
That's right. Her identity, or rather the fact that they tried to force her into just one racial category, shows how ridiculous these rigid classifications really are. It highlights how these categories aren't natural, but are made up by society to control and divide people.
Makes you really question the whole concept of race, doesn't it? If someone can be both Black and Native American, then what do these categories even mean?
It's definitely something to think about. And Mildred Loving's story is a powerful reminder that identity is complex, and we need to challenge these simple and harmful racial classifications.
Definitely. And Coleman also talks about specific tribes, like the Chickahominy tribe in Charles City County, Virginia, that were frequently recategorized.
Yeah.
They had a tough time navigating these racial classifications and trying to get recognized by the state.
Yeah, the Chickahominy tribe story is particularly interesting because it shows the internal conflict caused by this whole push for racial purity. Some members chose to identify only as Indian, while others held on to both their Black and Indian heritage. It ended up creating divisions within the community.
It's just sad to see how these forced categories can split groups apart like that.
It is.
And then there's the Nottoway tribe. They're still fighting for state recognition even today, and their efforts have been held back by accusations of them having Black ancestry. This just shows how much these past injustices still affect us.
Yeah, the Nottaways situation really highlights how people in power, like the anthropologist Helen Roundtree, often shape historical narratives to fit their own agendas. Their story shows just how complicated and inconsistent it is to determine Native American identity, and how power dynamics play a huge role in this whole process.
It's definitely a lot to take in. We've covered so much already, and it's obvious that the way Native American identity was misrepresented is a really deep and painful part of American history.
Yes, it is.
But before we go any further into this complex and often heartbreaking story, let's just take a moment to think about what we've learned so far.
I think it's so important to remember that these events aren't just something that happened a long time ago. They still affect the present and the lives of Native American communities today.
Exactly. By understanding this, we can better understand the struggles for identity and recognition that Native American communities are still going through.
And it underscores how crucial it is to really think about the stories we've been told about race and history. By challenging these stories and listening to the voices of those who have been marginalized, we can start to build a more just and fair future.
I completely agree. And for anyone listening who wants to learn more about Erica Coleman's work, there's a link to a free PDF of her book in the show notes. Just go to Rafi's Linktree at linktree/AuTalkTons. Big thanks to Rafi, our amazing producer, for always finding us the best resources.
It's a book everyone should read if they want to understand how complicated race, identity, and belonging are in America.
All right, let's take a moment to process all of this, and then we'll come back to explore how these themes are still relevant today.
Wow, that was a lot to take in.
It really was. It's heavy stuff.
The extent to which they manipulated those racial categories to disenfranchise Native Americans is just mind-blowing.
Yeah, it really is. And to be honest, reading about all these injustices, it often makes me feel kind of overwhelmed and almost helpless. Like, what can we even do to fix things?
That's a really valid feeling, and I think a lot of people feel that way, but I think acknowledging these injustices is a good first step towards addressing them.
Right. Understanding the past is key to creating a better future.
Exactly. And, as we continue reading through The Blood Stay Pure, it becomes clear that Virginia's obsession with racial purity wasn't just about keeping races separate. It was about power and control. And ultimately, it was about land.
Yeah, Coleman is peeling back all these layers of history and showing us how they used and twisted racial categories for their own gain. And the way this impacted Black-Indian relations is especially striking to me. These were communities linked by shared history and culture, but they were often turned against each other.
Right. Coleman challenges that traditional narrative that only focuses on Native Americans as victims of white oppression. She really highlights how anti-Black racism, which often came from internalized colonial ideologies, took root in some Native American communities as well.
It shows how oppression can create this ripple effect. where marginalized groups sometimes end up hurting each other.
Exactly. And this internalized racism often showed up in the form of blood quantum requirements for tribal membership.
You keep mentioning blood quantum, but I'm not sure all of our listeners know what that is. Could you explain it a bit?
Sure. So, blood quantum is a way to measure how much Indian blood someone has based on their ancestors. It's usually expressed as a fraction, like 1/4 or 1/8.
So, like, if your great-grandparent was full-blooded Native American, you would have 1/8 blood quantum.
Yes, exactly. And these blood quantum requirements were often used to exclude people from tribal membership if they didn't meet a certain level.
It seems like a really random and flawed way to define someone's identity.
Oh, it absolutely is. And Coleman's book really points out how these blood quantum requirements were often based on the same racist ideas that fueled the one-drop rule. It was all about defining and controlling who was considered Indian and who wasn't.
And those attempts to control identity had some really bad consequences for Black-Indian relations, right?
Yeah, definitely. During the 19th century, there was so much pressure to maintain racial purity that it strained those Black-Indian relations, especially with the threat of being reclassified racially.
So even if you had strong cultural ties to a Native American tribe, but also had any African ancestry, you were in danger of being reclassified as Black.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that the line between Black and Indian wasn't so clear back then. Terms like colored or mulatto were used in really inconsistent ways, often hiding the real racial makeup of individuals and communities.
It sounds like a recipe for disaster, creating so much confusion that it made it easy to exploit people.
Absolutely, it was. It was a situation ripe for exploitation. Coleman actually talks about court cases where people's racial identities were put on trial, which shows just how arbitrary and contradictory those racial categories were.
It's just mind-blowing that someone's whole life could depend on how a court decided to classify them racially.
Yeah, it was a harsh reality for many people back then. And those legal battles really show how power dynamics shaped how race was defined. Whoever had the power to classify and categorize people had a huge influence over their lives.
It reminds us that race isn't some biological fact, but a social construct used to create hierarchies and justify inequality.
Right, exactly. And one of the most disturbing examples of how they manipulated those racial categories is the story of the Dingiskin tribe.
What happened to them?
Well, starting in the late 1700s, white settlers kept asking to get rid of the tribe's reservation. They used the fact that there were Black and mixed-race individuals living there as an excuse.
So they were basically saying, hey, look, they have Black Indian families, so they're not real Indians anymore. Let's take their land.
Exactly. Their whole argument was that the tribe was no longer a real Indian tribe because they had intermarried with Black people. It was a deliberate strategy to make the tribe seem less legitimate so they could take their land.
It's the classic divide and conquer tactic. Turn groups against each other to weaken them.
Yep. And sadly, it worked. By the middle of the 1800s, the Gingiskin Reservation was gone. A truly tragic outcome that was fueled by this manipulation of racial categories and greed for Native American land.
It's just heartbreaking to see how easily they use these tactics to justify taking land from Native Americans.
It is. And Coleman doesn't shy away from these tough parts of history. She goes into detail about the complicated relationship between Black and Native American communities within the system of slavery. She challenges that common idea that slavery was only an African experience.
Right, we often forget that Native Americans were enslaved too.
It's a really important part of the story that often gets left out. Coleman really digs deep into those runaway slave notices and legal cases from that time. She uncovers evidence of Indian slavery and the sometimes close relationships between enslaved Black people and Native Americans.
So despite all the efforts to separate them, there were moments of solidarity and shared struggle between those communities.
Absolutely. One great example is the story of Archer, a free man of color, who shared stories passed down through generations about his Powhatan ancestors. He talked about their experiences with slavery and losing their land.
It's like a testament to how strong those communities were and how they held onto their cultural ties, even in the face of so much hardship.
It is. Archer's story also highlights how important oral histories and family stories are. They help us piece together a more complete picture of the past, especially when official records are incomplete or deliberately distorted.
Right. History isn't just about what's in textbooks. It's about real people and what they went through.
Exactly. Those oral histories give us such valuable insights into the complex relationship between Black and Native American communities, especially within the context of slavery.
It seems like there's a clear pattern here. Whether it's deliberately misclassifying people, twisting the legal system, or erasing shared histories, the main goal was to take land away from Native Americans.
Yeah, it's a tough truth that we have to face. And as we get into the next part of our deep dive, we'll see that this pattern of erasure and manipulation continued into the 20th century, directly affecting the struggles for recognition that Native American communities are still dealing with today.
Wow, it's a lot to absorb, but it's crucial to understand these complicated historical issues if we want to address the inequalities that Indigenous people are still experiencing today.
Absolutely. By understanding how those racial categories were made up and used as weapons, we can start challenging the systems that are keeping those injustices alive.
And by listening to the stories of the people who have been pushed aside and silenced, we can start to break down the harmful narratives that have shaped how we see history.
Well said. Now let's take a moment to think about all of this before we move on to the final part of our exploration of Erica Coleman's powerful book.
Welcome back to our deep dive, everyone. So in this last part, we're really focusing on the long-term effects of this whole idea of racial purity.
Yeah, it's about understanding how those historical events still impact us today, especially for Native American communities.
And as we've seen, the manipulation of those racial categories didn't just disappear. It went on well into the 20th century, and we're still seeing the effects of it.
Absolutely. A perfect example is the fight that many tribes still have today to get recognized by the state. That legacy of misclassification and the power structures that benefit from keeping things the way they are make it even harder.
You've mentioned state recognition a couple of times now, but why is it so important for tribes?
It's more than just symbolic, you know? It gives tribes rights and sovereignty, things like getting federal funding for education and healthcare, economic development. It also lets tribes govern themselves and protect their culture.
So it's really about them having the power to decide their own future.
Exactly. And for tribes that have been pushed aside and denied recognition, it's about survival. It's about claiming their rightful place in society and making sure future generations can thrive.
And the Nottoway tribe in Virginia is a good example of this, right? They've been fighting for state recognition for decades, but it seems like there's always something blocking their way.
The Nottoway story is a perfect example of how that legacy of racial purity and misclassification still hangs over Native American communities. Their requests for recognition have been denied over and over, often based on really weak arguments that are just rooted in those same old racist ideas we've been talking about.
It's just crazy how much power those flawed ideas about race still have over people's lives.
It really is. And what's even more disheartening is that their struggle has been made harder by some anthropologists who have questioned whether they're a real tribe.
Wait, I thought anthropologists were supposed to be supporting Indigenous communities. How could they be part of the problem?
It's complicated. A lot of anthropologists do amazing work supporting Native American rights and helping preserve their culture. But there have been times when anthropologists have, maybe without realizing it, reinforced harmful stereotypes or questioned the tribe's authenticity just because they didn't really understand the history and culture.
So even when people have good intentions, they can still end up spreading harmful ideas.
Yeah, unfortunately. And this is why it's so important to be really critical of ourselves and our own biases, especially when you're working in a field like anthropology where power dynamics and cultural sensitivity are super important.
It's a good reminder for all of us to check our own biases and be ready to challenge the status quo when it's not fair.
I completely agree. And even though there are all these challenges, it's important to see how resilient and determined Native American communities are.
That's true. They've been through centuries of oppression and attempts to erase them, but they're still fighting for their rights, their culture, and their future.
It's truly inspiring. And Erica Coleman's book really highlights that strength. It's like a call to action for all of us to learn from the past, really see what's happening in the present, and work towards a future that's just and fair for everyone.
It's a really powerful message. So to wrap things up, what are some of the key things you hope our listeners will remember from this deep dive?
I hope they come away with a better understanding of how racial categories were created and used as weapons throughout history to justify oppression and taking land away from people. It's not just about learning facts, it's about really thinking about the stories we've been told and challenging the systems that are causing those injustices.
It's about realizing that history isn't just in the past. It's still shaping our world today, and it's our responsibility to learn from it and work towards a better future.
Exactly. And it's about letting those who have been marginalized and silenced have their voices heard, especially Native American communities who are still fighting for recognition, the right to govern themselves, and justice.
Well said. And for everyone listening who wants to learn more about this topic, you should definitely check out Urka Coleman's book, That the Blood Stay Pure. Our fantastic producer, Rafi, got us a link to a free PDF, and you can find that in the show notes. Just go to Rafi's linktree/Autochtons.
It's a must-read for anyone who wants to understand the complexities of race, identity, and belonging in America, and how racial injustice is still affecting us today.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep the conversation going.